back by popular demand for the third year in a row, I am so honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Dean Banaian. And our audiences have raved about Dean Banaian's informative and entertaining presentation style, which, as you know, for an economist, is not very typical. So you're going to hear some great information and you're going to be entertained. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that, right? Dean Banaian, I'll give a little background, very, very impressive information. He is a professor in the Department of Economics and Dean of the School of Public Affairs at St. Cloud University. And I know we have some grads here today. He holds a PhD in economics from the Claremont Graduate School, and he is consulted at the central banks of Ukraine, Egypt, and Macedonia, and the ministries of finance of Indonesia, Macedonia, and Armenia. Dean Banaian is author of 2 books and more than 40 articles and book chapters discussing monetary policy and political economy. He is a former state representative from St. Cloud and is co-author of the St. Cloud Quarterly Business Report and host a radio program in Minneapolis. This is a very busy person, and we're really honored to have him here today. And his topic today is, are the good times still rolling? So please join me, a round of applause for Dean Banaian.
Let's see if the mic's working. It is. Great. So thank you for having me here today once more. It's kind of cool when you get invited back for a third time. One thing that's wonderful is they must think you're okay. And for economists, okay is great. Okay, because typically if they tell you you're good, it's like, well, you didn't put me to sleep. And which is kind of par for the course. I have been working as a dean for the last 5 years, and Marnie was nice enough to mention the 2 books I've already written. I'm going to spend a little time toward the end of this talk today using something I'm working on toward a 3rd book that I've started on. I haven't found a publisher for it yet, but I hope to sometime soon. I'm actually in talk with 1 or 2. I'm just working on that idea right now. Which probably means when I get deep into the book, I'll probably have to do something other than being a dean, because that doesn't give you enough time to do that. But anyway, I want to get right to the talk, because I was told you need 10. We probably want about 10 minutes for a conversation, and we want 10 minutes to have our sponsors talk about their businesses and their success as well. So we're going to move pretty fast through a bunch of slides. I already took about half a dozen of them out, but I probably should have taken more, so I'm going to go really fast. Here's some preliminary information about the Minnesota economy, just to give you a context in which we can talk about some things today. Particularly talking about Minnesota, in particular Minneapolis. The Minnesota economy is kind of an average size economy. So there's 50 states. So if every state was equal, you'd have 2% of production in every state. We have a little less than 2%, just about 2%. So we're, unlike Garrison Keillor, we're just a titch below average. Rather than above average. Nominal GDP growth, I've got that graph for you. The blue line is Minnesota, the yellow line is the country as a whole. I've blocked out the others to keep keep the graph simple. You can see that we grew faster than the nation up through the beginning of 2017, but we've actually slowed in the last 1.5 to 2 years. I would normally have additional data here, but the shutdown caused me a little bit of an issue, and I'll show you, in fact, kind of what makes forecasting right now a little more difficult, because we have less data than we typically do. And just to remind you of what the economy looks like in Minnesota, those bars over on the right reflect the goods sector of the economy, generally speaking, except for ag, which in the state of Minnesota just isn't terribly much. You can see construction's a little bit. We produce a lot more in manufacturing in durable goods than in non-durable goods. That's an important point, because if you're a durable good manufacturer, you're much more sensitive to the range of the business cycle than you are if you produce non-durables. Non-durable goods and services are typically recession resistant. Durable goods are not. And many of you are in businesses that produce durable goods. So the business cycle really matters to you. If I take a look at that picture just for the area of Minneapolis, I know Marnie was nice enough to share share the guest list with me, so I know that some of you have actually traveled here from my neck of the woods. thank you so much for making the drive. I know it wasn't the easiest drive today. It hasn't been an easy drive for about a month, it seems. But thank you for being here. But for most of you, even those of you who are located up in central Minnesota in the St. Cloud area, or I think someone actually drove from further west than St. Cloud, from out in the western half of Stearns County, you're doing business in this market. Here's the marketplace that it looks like. And here it's even more so. 10% of all the GDP produced in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market, the 7-county area, actually is in that durable manufacturing area. And when you see fluctuations in GDP, they're not coming out of places like fire state. Does not mean fire. It means finance, insurance, and real estate. It's an abbreviation. And then healthcare is 11%. Well, guess what? Healthcare is not a function of whether or not the business cycle is good or bad. Yes, you might plan LASIK surgery, or you might plan that plastic surgery based on whether or not the checkbook's full or empty. But when you need a procedure for your heart, you're not checking to say, oh, the unemployment rate's high, I probably shouldn't be doing this right now. No, you just go get it done. So it's not it doesn't fluctuate terribly much. And so what I really wanted you to pay attention to is this piece here. Construction's about 4%, durable manufacturing 10%, non-durable 6%. And that's what's happening in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market as of 2017, which is the latest data we have on what's going on here. Now, I've been trying to talk to people about something a little different over the last 6 to 9 months or so, because I find two things. First of all, if you have me back for a third time, and there are some groups for whom I've done a presentation like this for going on 15 years, every year. After a while, I worry that I'm getting stale. And so I try to throw something different to try to get people to think differently. I've done some talk with you, I think last year, I looked at last year's presentation, and we talked about thinking about risk to a forecast. I'm not going to do that this time. What I really want to talk to you about instead is something that's even, I think, more fundamental to the whole process of forecasting. We tend to see patterns when in fact there are none. Sometimes stuff is just random, but our brains are wired to try to find a pattern in something where there may not be one. Why? Because it's the nature of who we are. Michael Shermer, the philosopher, is the one who said this at the top. We are pattern-seeking storytellers. Right? We tell stories, okay? And so I always would teach my students in forecasting, and I met one of them. One of them is here tonight, who I think might have me. Did you have me for forecasting? No? Yes? If you had me for forecasting, you would know that one of the things I tell you is, you can have the numbers, but you darn well better have a story, because your numbers will be wrong. If you have a story for why they're wrong, you might get away with that and be able to keep your job for another year. But if your numbers are wrong and you don't have an explanation for why they're wrong, your job security is not very good. So, you rather have a story in place. So I have a story in mind for me. So I went ahead and talked about this, and here's just an example for you. This is the fortune cookie story that actually comes from a study that was done on, how many of you read the website 538, Nate Silver's website? Okay, a few of you do, okay. 530, this was on 538's website about 3 years ago. I love this story, where someone tried to make patterns out of fortune cookies. They took up a bunch of fortune cookies, digitized all the answers, and came up with these facts about what was inside them. Do we think they tell us anything about the world? No. They might tell me something about the people who make fortune cookies, but they probably don't tell me very much about what happens in the world as a whole. But yet, there are people out there. Well, I have other examples of this, right? I remember those things that Marnie talked about where I worked overseas, some of that work happened after 9/11. And a lot of the work that happened during 9/11 was based on this whole idea that somehow poverty breeds terrorism. So if we could do poverty reductions in places that had places where terrorists come from, maybe we could reduce the amount of terrorism that happened in the world. Well, if you think about 9/11, the country that they came from, there is no poverty program. I won't name the country, you probably all know who I'm talking about. But there was no poverty program there because there was no poverty there. Right? So Likewise, should we be scared about the fact that the Patriots won the Super Bowl again?
Yeah.
Right? They won it again. That the stock market's going to fall because an old AFL team, the New England Patriots, were, when I was a kid, the Boston Patriots. Should we have worried about that? Well, I wouldn't think so. That's a case where correlation doesn't mean causation. So I always tell people, be careful about drawing long, big stories out of some connected fact, okay? Because we tend to connect things. And it turns out that ever since Leonard Coppett in the New York Times came out with the study saying, when AFL teams win, the stock market goes down, it hasn't been true from the moment it happened. Okay? It's not true at all. Okay? It was true until 1978. It has been true for the last 40 years. But damned if I didn't read another story in the last week about, well, if the AFL wins, that means the stock market's going to go down. No, it doesn't. Please stop saying that. It's only been 40 years. My heavens. The problem is, there's still demand for guys like me to still make predictions. Why? Because people want them. I love this story. This story is from Ken Arrow. Unless you've been a long-time economist, there's a really good chance you've never heard of Kenneth Arrow. Kenneth Arrow won the Nobel Prize, right? And he won the Nobel Prize during World War II. He was assigned to be a weather forecaster. And they said, you know what, our weather forecasts are really terrible. And they wrote a letter to the generals and said, generals, you should have us do something else because we're not able to predict the weather any better than just flipping a coin. And the generals said, we know you're not any better than flipping a coin, but we need your forecast for our plans. Why do they do that? Yet they do. So, what I hope I've just done is make you very skeptical of any forecast I'm about to give you in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Okay? Because if you don't treat it with skepticism, you've placed way too much faith in what some guy standing on a stage says. So it has to fit what you see, what's out there. And I'm going to show you some rules that I use to sort of give you a little more confidence in us forecasters. But frankly, I think people put too much faith in us rather than too little faith in us. And when I was talking about the weather and someone says, well, they just send out a notice 5 minutes beforehand. I said, you know what, if I could send a note 5 minutes before a recession happens, that'd be awesome. The problem is we don't normally tell you that a recession has happened until a year after it started. So the weather forecasters do a lot better at that than we do. So what can we do? I mean, first of all, understand that hindsight is not 20/20 because we tend to want to put patterns in places where they don't exactly happen. Secondly, how many of you know who Annie Duke is? There's a few hands that went up. I'm going to guess you know. So there's two ways you can know Annie Duke. She's got a famous book that's out, and she's been showing it at some management type meetings. But there's a better chance that you know Annie Duke because for a while she was the best women's professional poker player in the world. And she's been out trying to tell people to start thinking in bets. It's the name of her book, and if you haven't read Thinking in Bets, you darn well ought to. It's my one book recommendation for today. I always do a presentation with a book recommendation. That's this year's. Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke is a wonderful way to get people to think about it. So as you sit around your table and you say, well, we should plan for a recession that's going to happen in the fourth quarter of 2019 and we should start doing stuff. Somebody in your team ought to ask the question, do you want to bet on that? Or better, how much would you like to bet on that? Right? That's kind of the germ of Annie's thinking, and I think she's quite brilliant. By the way, she's a trained psychologist that got all the way to writing her dissertation before realizing she needed money, and because her brother, Howard Lederer, was already a pro poker player, she said, boy, I need a little money. I think I should start playing a little poker to make ends meet. I'll go back and finish the dissertation later. She's never finished the dissertation. But she just made a lot of money. The last bullet on that slide is something I want to point out to you. I want to use multiple models, all right? I want to use multiple measurements. I want to keep looking at additional data. Now, there's diminishing returns to looking at more and more data. But looking at one forecast and saying, okay, that's it. The AFL won, therefore the stock market is going down, is a pretty dumb way to make a forecast. So don't do that. So our strategy, and I call it the SCSU's forecast, I'm bold in saying that, and we've never officially titled it the SCSU forecast, but we do a series of forecasts on various portions of the Minnesota economy. And I'm going to talk more about the Twin Cities tonight than I do the St. Cloud area, where we've been doing St. Cloud. This month is the 20-year anniversary of the St. Cloud state of us doing our forecast. We've been doing it now. We started actually in December of 1998, but so we completed 20 years this cycle. Our forecast that we do now, which we've been doing for 5 years, is with the Secretary of State on this. And so we actually look at a group of different areas, and we try to use different measurements to try to figure out what's going on in those various marketplaces. The last thing to say is this. There are people, okay, you've heard this joke? Economists have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. Right? You've heard this joke. It's a pretty famous joke. It's true. We do it a lot. And it's dumb because we know better. The base case is always that the economy is in expansion. If you look at the history of the U.S. business cycle since 1900, the number of months in which we're in expansion is 5 times the number of months we're in recession. So, if the odds, if it turns out a recession happens, suppose they're random, right? It means that if you picked up one die and threw it, recessions are only going to happen when you land on the 6, on the boxcar. Every other die, every other side of the die, you don't get a recession. Why are we predicting 9 of the last 5? Why are we doing that? Because I think people love a story about doom and gloom. That kind of attracts attention. I'm not going to do that. I wish I could talk more about that, because I actually have like a half a presentation just on this. Why do we keep predicting so many darn recessions? Now, to say that, here's the Twin Cities area over the last few months. Take a look at this area that I've circled out. This is the leading economic indicator series that we've built for the Minnesota Secretary of State's office. This is just the 7-county metro area, so this is not anything to do with any kind of anything from the greater Minnesota area. So if you're doing business in greater Minnesota, this is not you. Okay, but down here, and it was interesting, we were wondering if this was a recession. And I want you to see that if you look at this Twin Cities leading economic indicators, we're down 5.2% over the last month. That's the change. And we're down, 4 of these 5 measures are down. Now this guy here, this unemployment insurance claims, that's an inverse indicator. When the economy's going well, that number should go down. When the economy's doing poorly, that number goes up. So that's an inverse. But 4 out of 5 are pointing in the wrong direction over the last 12 months. Notice I use 12 months, not 3, even though I have monthly measures of this. There's a lot of fluctuation that happens from month to month, so I like using 12-month changes to try to... There's advantages in getting averages. So I've done that, but I looked at this, and we looked at this in the middle of 2016 and said, is there something wrong happening in the Twin Cities? Is there a potential for a recession there? And we looked at a bunch of other stuff, and we said the base case is no recession. We think it's going to probably turn back around, and sure enough, if we had said recession in the middle of 2016, we would have been wrong. We didn't respond to that. We said we need more information. We need to understand why the data look like that. And sure enough, they reversed on their own and went pretty much straight up through 2017. Now, the 2018 information, you can see I've got a little dip here, but compared to this, that's nothing. So I'm not going to call a recession on the basis of just that little bit of data. I need more than just that. I'm biased toward forecasting that the good times will keep rolling until I get a lot of evidence that they're going to stop. Because economies in general tend to grow. So I go ahead and look at some other forecasts. I'm going to show you a couple others. Minnesota Management Budget says for the state of Minnesota as a whole that GDP is going to go up 2.9% for the year that just ended. Because of the shutdown, we won't get that data for a little bit yet. But MMB and its forecast that they did in November said 2.7%. Now there's going to be a new forecast that will come out in about 2 to 3 weeks. I will be reading it with an eagle eye. My co-author, Rich McDonald, is on the Minnesota Council of Economic Advisors. He knows what the next forecast is. He's required by law not to tell me, even though we see each other once or twice a day. And I'm curious, but I know enough not to ask him because he can't tell me. He would be breaking the law to tell me that. It'll come out though, I'm trying to remember exactly the date. I think it's going to be on the 1st of March, exactly. On a Friday, we'll get that information. So Ernie Goss says, take a look and be careful. Manufacturing metal equipment and supplies will be the leading industry. Okay, I'm about to say to you right now, this is one of those, no, duh. That's like the easiest forecast you could have ever made, Ernie. I know, Ernie. Okay, I would say, no, duh, Ernie, to his face. Okay, and then transportation equipment is bad for us because that, guess what? That's a leading manufacturing sector in central Minnesota. Okay, because it covers everything in that sector. That's for us. That's Arctic Cat. That's Flyer. It's related to the same. It's a very similar marketplace to Electrolux, which you may have heard, is planned to close sometime toward the end of 2019 in the St. Cloud area. I live about a mile from the Electrolux plant, just outside of the Pantown neighborhood up there, and that's about 900 jobs. The knock-on effects probably add another 500 to 600 to that number, and that's a pretty major thing. We're trying to figure out right now how seriously are businesses in our community taking that. One of the things that's militating against that is they are anxious to get to. They're anxious to get to the workers that are inside that plant. You know where they have their skills would transfer to? Transportation equipment. New Flyer and Arctic Cat cannot, or Textron, which owns Arctic Cat, can't wait to get at those workers because worker shortages are a big deal. I'm not going to have much time to talk about that unless you ask me a question about it during our Q&A. This is from 249 Minnesota manufacturers surveyed by Dean. They did this survey in late 2018. They were either in the field in the week before, the week after Thanksgiving. I'm not sure which week they were in. But you can see that if you look here, I gave you a lot of information here, but I want you to just look at this information here. They believe that those 249 manufacturers saying orders and production is going to go lower, investment's going to fall off. Here's what's interesting to me. They think profits are going to increase, they think prices are going to increase, but when you ask them, how are you going to do that when orders fall, they say, it's okay, we're just going to become more productive. We're going to increase productivity. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, how much would you like to bet on that? That's a really interesting question. So another thing I've been looking at, and this is to transition us toward the other topic I wanted to get to, I think I gave myself about 10 minutes to get to it, is, maybe a little less, is creating new firms. One thing that's really happened here is that since the Great Recession, the rate at which we create new firms in this state has fallen by at least almost exactly half. Creating new firms has become something we do less in Minnesota now than we did during the period of the 90s and all the way up to the Great Recession. Okay, I've even taken out that period from 2006 through the middle of 2010 because, of course, businesses were falling off over that period. No one was creating a new business in 2008 and 2009. It'd be unfair to do that. So I don't start that till I get into the second half of 2010, but even between the second half of 2010 and the end of 2018, you can, or the end of 2017, you can see that rate is only at 1/2 the rate of the old one. Okay, this means that currently there are 5.8% fewer firms in Minnesota than there would have been had we had the old net new firm growth rate of about 1.4% a year. We're down 5.8%. Now, what do new firms do? Do they go into existing businesses? Do they do existing things? What do they do? They are looking for new opportunities, new places, new lines of product, but they're relying on production, relying on the supply system, the worker system, the education system of the place they're in already. And so this is sort of the point I'm doing in this book, is to try to talk about the history of, I'm doing it on Central Minnesota, so it's the history of St. Cloud from the beginning to later in time here. So let me go forward to this. So this is a location quotient. I'll leave this up for a second to say, I'm going to use this to tell me where I could find a firm, how I can figure out what areas am I most specialized in. Okay? So for manufacturing, the location quotient for the Twin Cities is 1.2, meaning for a city of your size, of this size, you have 20% more workers in the manufacturing sector than other cities of this size. You're a manufacturing heavy area. That was not true, by the way. If you go back, this is the information from 2018. If you go back to 1990, that wasn't true. While the rest of the country has dropped the number of people working in manufacturing, that has not been true in this market. You've actually maintained and slightly grown the depth of manufacturing in this community relative to other places in the U.S. And the places where they've grown the most are in these particular sectors, these subsectors. For those of you that speak the language of the Labor Department, these are 3-digit NAICS codes areas. Okay, so these are subsectors by NAICS, if you want to know what they are. And I could have cut them up even finer than this, but this is close enough.
Medical device manufacturing, is that scattered throughout?
It's actually in miscellaneous.
Miscellaneous.
Yeah.